In the 1300s, something as simple as the color of a garment could be more than just a matter of style. It could be a matter of law, even a source of fear or fascination. At first glance, these rules might seem trivial or even quaint to us, but for those who lived in the medieval world, they were anything but. The sumptuary laws, as they were called, were like a silent code woven into the very fabric of daily life, regulating not just clothing, but the shape of an entire society. They told people, in no uncertain terms, what they were allowed to wear, and by extension, who they were allowed to be. In this world, where order was sacred and hierarchy was everything, these rules carried a weight that stretched far beyond mere vanity. The setting of these laws was a world of breathtaking contrasts. Cathedrals rose above the skyline like stone prayers, their shadows falling across crowded market squares where merchants peddled their wares under striped awnings. In narrow streets, the scent of baking bread mingled with the murmur of voices in every dialect of the kingdom, each person moving to the rhythm of a society that left little room for change. Every tunic, every cloak was a statement, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, of a person's station in life. This was a world where a single choice of fabric could invite suspicion or worse, and where even the smallest flourish of color might be enough to provoke envy, admiration, or punishment. The sumptuary laws were precise and unyielding. They told knights and ladies how to dress for courtly banquets, merchants how to appear at the city gates, and peasants what to wear on feast days. They reached far beyond clothing, extending into the realm of feasting and festivity. Weddings were weighed and measured, their costs capped, and their grandeur restrained. Even the gleam of a silver cup or the sparkle of a ring might fall under the watchful eye of these laws, ensuring that the outward trappings of a household never dared to outshine the station of its owner. In a time when birth and fortune were destiny, these rules were not idle suggestions. They were as binding as the knight's oath or the priest's vow. Yet despite the strictness of these codes, they were not merely about control. They were about reinforcing the invisible scaffolding that held the medieval world together. They were the guardians of an order believed to be divinely inspired, an order that shaped every interaction and every moment of daily life. The merchant with a keen eye for profit knew that even the finest goods must be offered with caution. The tailor, whose craft could elevate or destroy reputations, walked a careful line between skill and discretion. In this delicate dance, every choice was watched, every gesture measured. For those who lived under these laws, clothing became a kind of language, a sleeve cut too wide, a trim too luxurious, or a hint of finery in the wrong hands could spark gossip, or even invite the scrutiny of the local magistrate. Dreams of elegance were balanced against the weight of the statutes, and the quiet ambition of a craftsman, or the whispered aspirations of a merchant's wife, might find themselves forever hemmed in by lines of ink on parchment. Each thread was more than just cloth. It was a thread in the larger tapestry of social order. Markets were the stages on which these quiet dramas played out. A bolt of fabric displayed too brazenly might tempt fate, and the flicker of interest in a customer's eye was often tempered by the memory of penalties that could follow. Tailors learned to speak in half-finished phrases, hinting at luxuries they dared not offer outright. Merchants traded in half-promises and careful silences, as wary of the law as they were eager to sell their wares. Behind every stall and every cart lay the quiet knowledge that the wrong choice of color or cloth could undo years of careful planning. It is only in the final breaths of this carefully measured world that we find the true source of fascination. The color that stirred both longing and fear, the hue that marked the wearer as something beyond ordinary, a shade so rich, so luminous, that it seemed to hold all the power of kings and queens in its folds. A color born of crushed sea snails and cloaked in centuries of legend. It shimmered like a secret against the muted backdrop of browns, grays, and blues. And in this world of strict rules and careful watchfulness, that color was not just forbidden. It was a quiet promise of everything that lay just beyond the reach of law. In this intricate world of medieval color and cloth, the sumptuary laws themselves were both a reflection of social anxieties and a carefully crafted system of control. While the previous part introduced the sweeping idea of these laws as guardians of hierarchy and visible order, it's worth pausing here to understand them more deeply. Sumptuary laws were not random or isolated. They were deliberate, codified systems that governed every aspect of display and consumption. They arose from a blend of moral judgment, economic fear, and a desire to keep the world as predictable and structured as the rigid lines of a noble's family crest. The very word sumptuary finds its roots in the Latin sumptus, meaning expense, and that captures the spirit of these laws perfectly. They were about curbing excessive spending and keeping the flamboyant urges of those with newly acquired wealth in check. But they also went much further, speaking to the collective fear that if social markers could be bought, the entire order of medieval life might come undone. A merchant who could dress like a noble was not just showing off. He was blurring the line between birth and ambition. And that was a deeply unsettling prospect for a world that saw rank and blood as immutable. Sumptuary laws, therefore, read like moral manifestos as much as they did legal codes. They forbade certain people from wearing velvet, silk, or purple dyes, not only because these were expensive, but because these items had become potent symbols of authority and status. To see someone in purple who had no ancestral claim to nobility was to witness a silent rebellion. The law's detailed language, specifying who could wear fur, how many gold threads could adorn a garment, and even the width of a sleeve, became a sort of script for this grand social theater, ensuring that everyone played the part assigned to them by birth or office. What is perhaps most striking about these laws is their sheer scope. They didn't merely target clothing, though that was their most visible concern. They extended to weddings and funerals, to feasts and festivals, regulating how many courses a meal could include, how much could be spent on a bride's dowry, and which items of furniture could grace a home. In these details, we see a world that feared not only the excesses of wealth, but also the chaos that might come from ambition unchecked. It was a world that wanted to keep every feast, every garment, and every celebration safely confined within the old social boundaries. These codes were written and enforced by kings, councils, and magistrates, those who saw themselves as the guardians of divine order. In England, Edward III's sumptuary edicts of the mid-1300s spelled out who could wear which colors and fabrics. In Italy, city-states like Florence passed repeated laws to stop wealthy merchants from dressing in ways that challenged the grandeur of the nobility. Across Europe, similar statutes were drafted and redrafted, constantly updated to keep pace with the restless energy of new wealth and the changing fashions it inspired. Enforcement was sometimes harsh, fines that could ruin a household, garments confiscated as a warning, and public shaming for those who dared to challenge the old codes. Yet even as these laws tried to draw unyielding lines, they revealed a world in flux. The 1300s saw the rise of a merchant class whose wealth came not from ancestral lands, but from trade and craft. These merchants dressed themselves in ways that declared their success, even if the law said otherwise. In every bustling market square, the tension between tradition and ambition was woven into the cloth itself. The sumptuary codes were meant to keep this ambition in check, to force it back into the shadows. But in their strictness, they also betrayed a deep anxiety. If wealth alone could buy the trappings of nobility, what did that mean for the ancient order of birth and blood? These anxieties also tell us something about medieval values. Beneath the concern for cloth and color lay a profound belief that what you wore said everything about who you were. Clothing was seen as a second skin, an outward sign of an inward truth. To defy the sumptuary codes was to defy not just social convention, but the moral and spiritual order itself. For the medieval mind, every golden thread or purple hem had a place, and to wear it wrongly was to challenge the very way the world was meant to be. In this way, sumptuary laws became a silent but powerful language that shaped medieval life. They told people where they belonged and warned them not to dream too far beyond it. And as we move from the world of purple and velvet into the bustling marketplaces and castle halls of the 1300s, we can see how these laws created a stage on which the drama of rank and ambition played out in every garment, every feast, and every carefully measured thread. As sumptuary laws became a framework for daily life, they were perhaps most strikingly expressed through the color purple. Purple was the color that announced power and privilege more clearly than any other hue. This color had an ancient heritage, going back to Roman emperors and Byzantine court ceremonial, and by the 1300s, it had become the ultimate mark of high rank and sacred authority. In a world where every thread had significance, purple was a symbol that carried centuries of meaning woven into the very fabric of medieval identity. The dye that made purple possible was known as Tyrian purple, derived from the murex sea snail. Extracting this dye was a painstaking task. Thousands of snails were crushed to yield just a few drops of the precious pigment. The process was both labor-intensive and costly, and this rarity gave the color its symbolic weight. The color itself was not just a vibrant hue, but a shimmering, almost luminous presence that seemed to radiate from the fabric. It spoke of the deep oceans and the hidden labors of countless workers, of kingdoms that traded across distant seas and empires built on the traffic of luxury goods. By the 1300s, purple had become a kind of wearable crown, worn by kings and queens, bishops and high lords. In the courts of medieval Europe, to wear purple was to signal that you stood closest to the center of power. In an age when color could define one's destiny, purple was the color of divine favor and secular might, a blending of heavenly symbolism and worldly authority. It was reserved for those who could claim a direct connection to God's will and the earthly order he had ordained. The sumptuary laws recognized this sacred significance and turned it into a legal reality. statutes were written with meticulous precision, outlining exactly who could wear purple and under what circumstances. In England, for instance, purple silk or velvet was the exclusive domain of the royal family and a handful of the highest-ranking nobles. In Florence, purple was also tied to civic identity, worn by those who held high office or who had earned the city's special favor. Everywhere, purple was a boundary line, a color that belonged to the few and was jealously guarded by law. These laws were not just about appearances, they were about preserving the stability of a world where hierarchy was seen as divinely inspired. To wear purple without the right was to disrupt the very foundation of medieval life. It was an act that threatened not only social order, but also the cosmic harmony that people believed governed the world. This was a society that saw the divine and the earthly as intimately connected, and purple sat at the heart of that connection. Yet, even as these laws imposed strict boundaries, the beauty and allure of purple were undeniable. In a dimly lit hall or a flickering candlelit chapel, the shimmer of a purple cloak was a sight that could captivate the senses and stir the imagination. Those who were forbidden from wearing it might still dream of the color, seeing in its deep tones a glimpse of a life beyond their own station. The laws may have drawn rigid lines, but the desire to cross those lines was ever present, an unspoken longing woven into the warp and weft of medieval life. Purple also carried with it echoes of the sacred. In the vestments of bishops and the ceremonial robes of abbots, it was a reminder that power itself was seen as a divine gift, granted by God and expressed in every thread of these rich fabrics. The color's association with Christ's passion and the Roman emperors who claimed to rule by divine right gave it a spiritual weight that could not be ignored. This was why sumptuary laws treated purple with such gravity. It was not merely expensive. It was a symbol of a cosmic hierarchy that demanded to be respected. In the marketplace and the tailor's workshop, these laws turned every bolt of purple cloth into an object of intense scrutiny. Merchants who dealt in such costly dyes had to keep careful records of their customers, ensuring that no one of lesser status could purchase them without risking punishment. Tailors and seamstresses had to work within the law's restrictions, measuring every cut and stitch against the legal codes. For them, purple was not just a color, but a delicate dance between profit and propriety, a balance that could bring wealth or ruin depending on who claimed the right to wear it. And so, the color purple stood at the crossroads of wealth, power, and law. It was the color of the sea snail's hidden labor, the labor of the dyers, and the dreams of those who gazed longingly at a fabric they could never claim. It was the color of bishops' solemn processions and kings' grand banquets, a living symbol of the world's highest ranks and the divine order that medieval society believed held everything in place. This is how purple became more than a color. It became an emblem of the medieval imagination, a testament to the belief that even the smallest details of clothing could reflect the grand design of the universe. As sumptuary laws turned purple into a guarded treasure, they also made it a window into the hopes and fears of a world obsessed with order and hierarchy. As the color purple shimmered in the halls of kings and bishops, it was set against a medieval world that was as rich in contrasts as it was in ambition. The 1300s were an age of towering cathedrals and humble thatched cottages, of knights clad in shining armor, and peasants bound to the land by the ancient ties of feudal obligation. Every street and market square in this world told a story of power and struggle, and every garment worn was a visible reminder of that ever-present hierarchy. In the cities and towns of the 1300s, life bustled with a rhythm that was both timeless and ever-changing. Markets filled narrow, winding streets with the scent of spices and the jangle of coins, while merchants hawked their wares beneath brightly striped awnings. Carpenters and blacksmiths worked in open doorways, hammering out the tools and ornaments of daily life. In the fields beyond the city walls, peasants bent to the rhythm of the seasons, their lives measured out in plows and harvests, bound by duty to the lords whose lands they worked. All of this, the chatter of market stalls, the clang of the forge, the endless cycle of planting and reaping, unfolded beneath the watchful gaze of a social order that seemed as solid as the stone walls of a castle keep. The world of the 1300s was also a world of devotion and faith, where the church stood as both a refuge and a constant presence in daily life. Cathedrals soared above the muddy streets like stone prayers, their spires pointing towards the heavens. Inside, the flicker of candles and the scent of incense filled the air as priests and monks chanted the liturgy that marked the hours of the day. The church was more than a building. It was a center of learning, a source of comfort, and in many ways, the heart of medieval society's moral and spiritual compass. Yet amid this world of faith and tradition, the seeds of change were already stirring. Trade was growing, driven by merchants who traveled far beyond the city gates in search of silk, spices, and the fabled luxury goods of the East. Ships laden with goods from distant lands docked at crowded ports, their holds filled with treasures that defied the strictures of sumptuary law. Wealth was no longer confined to the noble estates. It was increasingly found in the bustling guild halls of the cities, in the hands of men and women who earned their fortunes through trade and craft. These new fortunes brought with them new tensions, as the old rules of rank and privilege strained to contain a rising tide of ambition. The laws that governed what a person could wear and how they could live were never just about preserving the old order. They were about holding back the forces of change. As merchants grew rich and towns expanded, the fine lines that once separated noble from commoner became harder to police. Sumptuary laws became a kind of anxious response to this new world of possibility. In them, the anxieties of the medieval mind found expression. The fear that wealth could buy a noble's appearance. The fear that a velvet cloak could hide a commoner's birth. These laws were the guardians of a world that saw its own reflection in every cloak and every color. Amid this world of shifting fortunes and rigid codes, daily life was filled with small acts of defiance and quiet negotiations. A prosperous merchant might risk the wrath of the sumptuary statutes for the chance to wear a silk-lined doublet to a feast, a silent challenge to the old ways. Tailors and dyers, their fingers stained with the deep hues of forbidden dyes, knew how to navigate these hidden currents, crafting garments that skirted the edges of the law. For the people of the 1300s, every choice in clothing, every stitch and every color became a subtle dance between tradition and ambition, between what was allowed and what was longed for. Even for those who had no hope of donning purple, the color's presence was a reminder of a world where every thread told a story. A simple woolen tunic might seem humble, but it spoke of the fields that grew the sheep's wool and the hands that spun it into yarn. A richly dyed cloak, glimpsed in the torchlight of a passing noble's procession, was a vision of a world beyond reach for most, yet a world that shimmered in the imagination all the same. In the quiet hours of the night, the glow of purple might haunt the dreams of a merchant's daughter or a craftsman's apprentice, a color that was at once forbidden and endlessly alluring. As the 1300s marched on, the world these laws sought to contain continued to shift and change. The old rhythms of field and feudal duty were joined by the restless energy of trade and craft. The laws of the time, no matter how strict, were always in dialogue with this dynamic world, adjusting and adapting, sometimes failing altogether to hold back the tides of human ambition and desire. And so, the sumptuary statutes, written in the careful script of royal edicts and city proclamations, became a kind of map to this world, one that showed not only the boundaries of rank and privilege, but also the endless dance between tradition and change. The sumptuary laws that defined who could wear purple or silk were not created in a vacuum. They arose in a world where trade and wealth were beginning to stir the old social order, weaving new threads of possibility and of anxiety into the medieval fabric. In the 1300s, merchants and artisans were becoming increasingly important players in the economic life of Europe, their fortunes built not on ancestral lands, but on ships and markets, on the hum of the loom and the clink of scales in bustling marketplaces. The rise of this new class of wealth meant that the signs of power, velvet, gold embroidery, even the precious purple dye, were no longer the sole possession of the nobility. These merchants and craftsmen traded in goods that came from as far away as China and the Middle East. Spices that once perfumed only royal tables now scented the feasts of prosperous townsfolk. Silk that had shimmered on the backs of queens now fluttered in the hands of wealthy merchant families. Even pearls, those luminous treasures of the sea, were finding their way into the necklaces of guildmasters' wives. Wealth had become a force that was harder and harder to ignore and much harder to contain. This was the world that sumptuary laws sought to control, a world in motion, humming with the energy of trade routes that stretched from Venice to Constantinople, from Bruges to Cairo. These routes carried more than goods. They carried ideas, dreams, and the quiet subversion of the old order. They carried the possibility that a merchant's son, dressed in fine cloth, might pass for a nobleman, or that a craftsman's daughter might one day wear silk at her wedding, despite the proclamations of kings. The markets of the 1300s were alive with color and sound, filled with goods that dazzled the senses. Bolts of bright cloth from Flanders, the soft gleam of Italian silks, the shimmer of gold-threaded brocades from the East. All these wonders found eager buyers among those who had the coin to pay. The careful lines of the sumptuary statutes tried to keep pace, forbidding the colors and fabrics that once belonged only to noble halls. But markets have always been places where law and desire meet, and desire has a way of slipping past the strictest of boundaries. In the shadow of these grand markets, small rebellions bloomed. A wealthy merchant might commission a tailor to line a sober woolen cloak with the faintest hint of silk, just enough to satisfy a longing for luxury, yet subtle enough to pass beneath the watchful eye of a magistrate. A merchant's wife might wear a velvet girdle, no more than a ribbon, really, yet rich with the colors of a forbidden dye. Each of these choices was a quiet negotiation, a way of balancing ambition with caution, of testing the edges of what the law allowed. For the tailors, the dyers, and the cloth merchants, these choices were their daily bread. They learned how to work within the shifting maze of statutes and proclamations, offering their clients a taste of splendor without tipping over into open defiance. These artisans were the interpreters of a world that was never entirely stable, never entirely still. Their work was a kind of quiet conversation with the law itself, sometimes respectful, sometimes sly, always shaped by the dreams of those who wore the garments they made. As trade continued to grow, so did the gap between what the law demanded and what people wanted. Wealth whispered of possibilities that the sumptuary laws could not always silence. A noble's cloak might still be purple, but a merchant's robe, though legally humbler, could be lined with silks that spoke of distant lands and the power of gold. The color of ambition was not always as vivid as Tyrian purple, but it was no less potent. It glowed in the deep reds and greens of Italian brocades, in the shimmer of a velvet sleeve, in the secret sigh of a merchant's wife who dared to dream of a world where the color of one's cloak might change with one's fortunes. This tension between law and wealth, tradition and trade, was the heartbeat of the 1300s. It was a world where the lines between noble and commoner were drawn and redrawn with every new shipment of goods, with every bolt of cloth unloaded at the docks. Sumptuary laws were both a reaction and a mirror to this restless energy. They reflected the fear that if wealth could buy beauty, it might also buy power, a fear that haunted the old order as surely as the toll of a cathedral bell. In the end, this world of trade and wealth was not a world of simple defiance. It was a world of negotiations, of quiet ambitions and careful compromises. The glow of purple, though reserved for the highest of the high, was only one thread in a tapestry of shifting fortunes and daring dreams. For every merchant who obeyed the law, there was another who saw in the shimmer of silk the chance to stand, if only for a moment, in the glow of a world once reserved for kings. While the sumptuary laws were written with the weight of royal proclamations and civic statutes, their power depended on more than ink and parchment. In the bustling towns and farmlands of the 1300s, these laws took on life through the watchful eyes of those tasked with enforcing them. The local magistrates, the city councils, the guild leaders, and even the quiet gossip of the marketplace. In a world where a purple cloak could set a heart racing or a neighbor whispering, the guardians of these laws were everywhere, woven into the daily life of medieval society. City officials, known in different places as bailiffs, reeves, or wardens, were often the first line of defense in upholding the sumptuary statutes. Their job was to keep order in the towns, to ensure that the trades ran smoothly and the markets remained peaceful. But this duty also meant policing the subtle codes of dress and color. In bustling marketplaces, a magistrate's sharp eye might catch the forbidden glimmer of silk at a merchant's sleeve, or the deep, regal hue of a cloak that should have been worn only by the highest in the land. These officials were given the authority to fine, to confiscate, even to shame those who dared to wear what was not theirs by law. Beyond the magistrates stood the guilds, powerful associations of merchants and craftsmen that governed every aspect of trade and craft in the towns. The leaders of these guilds knew better than most the temptations of luxury and the delicate balance of law and ambition. It was in their interest to uphold the sumptuary codes, to ensure that trade remained honest and that no one's wealth or vanity threatened the careful order of the market. Guild leaders might levy fines on those who flaunted the rules or refused to sell certain dyes and fabrics to those who did not have the rank to wear them. Yet, the enforcement of these laws was never merely a matter of authority. It was also a matter of community. In small towns and tight-knit neighborhoods, the watchful gaze of one's neighbors was often more powerful than any royal decree. A woman who appeared at Mass in a cloak of purple might feel the weight of 1,000 curious eyes, the hush of whispers that could wound as sharply as any fine. A young man who dared to wear a velvet doublet meant for a noble might find his ambition met with the cold disapproval of those around him. In this way, the sumptuary laws were upheld not just by the threat of punishment, but by the quiet, constant surveillance of the community itself. The church, too, played its part in enforcing these codes. Priests and bishops, whose own robes shimmered with the weight of sacred authority, were quick to remind their congregations that pride and vanity were sins. Sumptuary laws took on the glow of moral commandments, woven into sermons about humility and the dangers of coveting what was not rightfully yours. A woman's choice of a silk-trimmed gown or a man's decision to wear too much gold could become a matter for confession, a stain on the soul, as well as a violation of the law. Despite the vigilance of magistrates, guild leaders, and clergy, enforcing these laws was never simple. Wealth had a way of opening doors that even the strictest statutes could not close. Fines could be paid, bribes discreetly offered, and favors traded in the shadows of the guild halls. In some towns, the lines between law and ambition blurred into quiet arrangements. A merchant's generosity to a local official, a promise of support to the church's building fund, and suddenly, the forbidden shimmer of silk might be overlooked. The balance between enforcement and evasion shaped the medieval world's social landscape. The sumptuary laws were like a river's banks, meant to guide the flow of society's currents. But the waters of ambition and desire were always shifting, always seeking new channels. Sometimes they spilled over in small acts of defiance, a velvet lining here, a pearl-trimmed headdress there. Sometimes they pooled quietly behind the closed doors of the wealthy, waiting for the moment when a new style, a new fortune, or a new favor might render the old boundaries moot. As the 1300s wore on, the laws themselves evolved. New proclamations were written, new statutes passed, all in the effort to keep pace with the restless tide of wealth and the ambitions it fueled. But behind every new edict stood the same anxious question: who was truly entitled to the symbols of power and privilege? And as the guardians of these laws, the magistrates, the guild leaders, the priests, did their best to hold the line, they also became part of the very world they sought to regulate, caught between the letter of the law and the murmur of dreams that refused to be silenced. As the laws sought to pin down the colors and cuts of medieval dress, fashion itself proved to be a restless spirit, always seeking new ways to express beauty, power, and status. In the 1300s, the art of clothing was not just a matter of practicality, it was a living language, spoken in the drape of a sleeve, the shimmer of a fabric, the daring tilt of a headdress. While the sumptuary laws tried to keep this language confined within the walls of rank and tradition, the very nature of fashion was to shift and change, echoing the desires of those who wore it. Clothing in the medieval world was more than protection from the cold or the mark of a household's wealth. It was an outward sign of a person's place in the world, and sometimes their aspirations to rise above it. A merchant's daughter might choose a dress of modest wool, but let it fall in gentle folds that echoed the flowing silks of a noblewoman's gown. A craftsman's wife might wear a simple cap, but line it with a bright color that hinted at dreams of finery. These small choices were the quiet language of ambition, and they found their way into every marketplace and guild hall. The turn of the 1300s saw fashions growing ever more elaborate. In noble courts and city squares alike, sleeves widened to dramatic proportions, and tunics became tighter and more closely tailored, a sign of the body's grace and strength. Men's doublets were cut to reveal a narrow waist, a hint of martial prowess and pride, while women's gowns swept the floors with rich layers of fabric, each pleat a testament to the skill of the tailor and the wealth of the wearer. Even the humble belt, cinched tight around the waist, became an object of desire, crafted in leather, tooled with gold, or studded with small gems that glimmered in the candlelight. Colors, too, spoke in their own dialect. Deep reds and blues, once the preserve of kings, began to trickle down into the wardrobes of wealthy merchants. The dyes that colored these garments came from distant lands, their creation a kind of alchemy that turned crushed insects and steeped roots into liquid gold. The very act of wearing such colors was a kind of quiet rebellion, a challenge to the idea that birth alone determined one's right to beauty. And so the sumptuary laws grew ever more precise, ever more anxious, trying to contain a tide that refused to be still. Fashion did not only borrow from the nobility, it also traveled between countries, crossing borders with merchants and envoys. Styles that began in the courts of France or the city-states of Italy soon appeared in London or Bruges, carried in the whispers of traveling tailors and the pages of pattern books that promised the latest look from Paris or Florence. What began as a noblewoman's headdress in one kingdom might become the dream of every merchant's wife in another. The sumptuary laws, tied as they were to a single kingdom's traditions, could never fully keep pace with the wide-reaching ambitions of the medieval imagination. For many, the dance of fashion was both a promise and a peril. To be seen in the latest style was to show that one was part of the great conversation of the age, that one had a place in a world that was always moving forward. But to step too far beyond what the law allowed was to risk fines, censure, and the quiet condemnation of neighbors and friends. The weavers and tailors who crafted these garments knew the stakes well. They were the artisans who walked the narrow path between artistry and caution, whose nimble fingers could both fulfill a client's dreams and weave a secret code of compliance. And so, the world of the 1300s found itself forever caught between the law's rigid lines and the ever-changing shapes of desire. The statutes of kings and city councils tried to freeze fashion in place, but the hearts of those who wore these clothes beat to a different rhythm. In the end, it was not the proclamations of sumptuary law that shaped the course of fashion. It was the quiet murmur of ambition, the hush of a silk hem in the torchlight streets, the soft glow of a forbidden color glimpsed beneath a cloak's edge. The story of sumptuary law was the story of this tension, the endless back and forth between power and possibility, between what was allowed and what was longed for. In every sleeve that flared beyond its station, in every hue that shimmered in defiance of an edict, the shifting tides of fashion told their own story. A story of people who dreamed of a world where beauty belonged to all. The medieval world was alive with color, and nowhere was this more visible or more fraught than in the fabrics that draped over shoulders and rustled through city streets. In a time when colors spoke louder than words, the dye in a merchant's cloak or the gleam of a lady's gown carried meanings that stretched far beyond mere decoration. The sumptuary laws, so precise in their attempts to pin down what was proper, were themselves a testament to the powerful symbolism that color held in the 1300s. Purple, of course, sat at the pinnacle of this symbolic hierarchy. This was not just any purple. It was a deep, rich hue, more precious than gold and more elusive than a king's favor. In an age when most colors were made from plants that grew in the fields, woad for blue, madder for red, purple was the prize of empire. Tyrian purple, drawn from the secretions of Mediterranean sea snails, was so expensive that it could bankrupt a merchant's household. Its deep, royal glow was a color of conquest and coronation, of bishops' robes and emperors' mantles. In the 1300s, to wear purple was to proclaim to the world that you held power and that you had the means to keep it. But purple was not the only color that spoke of status. Red, vibrant and warm, carried its own weight in medieval minds. The best reds came from kermes, the crushed bodies of tiny insects imported from distant lands. This was the color of life and blood, of passion and sacrifice. It was worn by kings and nobles as a symbol of their right to rule, but also by the church, whose cardinals wore robes of crimson to remind the faithful of the blood of martyrs. In cities and courts, red was a color that could quicken the pulse, a hue that signaled both power and peril, a warning and a promise in a single shade. Blue, too, held deep meaning. In a world that prized the rare and the costly, blue from woad was common enough, worn by peasants and tradesmen. But the deep, vivid blue of indigo, imported from far-off lands, was a color that could rival the night sky. This was the color of the Virgin Mary's robes in illuminated manuscripts, a color that spoke of purity, devotion, and mystery. To wear such a blue was to cloak oneself in the language of the sacred, to suggest a soul set apart from the mundane toil of daily life. Green, the color of life and springtime, carried its own quiet power. It was worn by those who labored in the fields, a natural color for a natural life. But it was also woven into the garments of those who wished to hint at fertility and renewal, at the promise of new beginnings. In the 1300s, green could be both humble and hopeful, a color that spoke of the turning of the seasons and the quiet resilience of the land. Each of these colors had its place in the sumptuary statutes. They were ranked and regulated, tied to one's station and one's birthright. But even as the laws tried to sort out who could wear what, the symbolism of these hues wove itself into every conversation, every glance across a crowded square. Colors were not just beautiful. They were alive with stories. each shade a window into a world of meaning that stretched far beyond the weave of the cloth. The dyers and weavers who crafted these colors were not merely artisans, they were alchemists of desire. They took the raw stuff of the earth and turned it into something that could change how a person was seen, how they saw themselves. The dyer's art was part science, part sorcery, a dance of boiling vats and secret formulas that could transform the mundane into the magnificent. In a world without bright electric lights, the glow of a deep red or the shimmer of a rich blue was more than a treat for the eyes. It was a spell, a kind of enchantment that could elevate a garment, and with it, the person who wore it. For those who could afford it, color became a kind of currency, traded and hoarded as carefully as silver or gold. A wealthy merchant might pay dearly for a cloak dyed in the richest hues, knowing that each thread of color whispered of his success. A noblewoman might weigh the choice of a green gown or a red kirtle like a poet crafting a line of verse, each shade a note in the melody of her life. The sumptuary laws were a reminder that these choices were not merely personal, they were political, declarations of loyalty or ambition that could echo in the halls of power. And yet, for all the care and calculation, color was also a source of joy. In the tapestries that covered cold stone walls, in the stained glass windows that caught the light of the sun, in the humble flowers that bloomed in the fields beyond the city gates, color was a promise of beauty in a world often marked by hardship. Even the strictest statutes could not keep that promise from taking root in the hearts of those who longed to wrap themselves in the colors of life. As the night deepens, let the rich tapestry of these medieval colors weave itself into your dreams. In the next part, we will explore how these shades of meaning, red for blood and kingship, blue for devotion and mystery, were not just symbols, but the very threads of medieval life, stitched into the daily rituals of a world where color was as powerful as any crown. In the gentle glow of flickering candlelight, the medieval world shimmered with colors that spoke volumes to those who knew how to read them. Every dye bath, every woven thread was an act of faith in the power of color to transform, to elevate, and to communicate. And in a time when spoken words might be lost in the echoing halls of a marketplace or the crowded pews of a church, color was a language that never faded. The power of this language was felt keenly in every layer of society. A nobleman might stride through the streets in a cloak of deep purple, the sun glinting off the folds of his garment, each ripple a statement of wealth and control. But for the merchant who sold him that cloth, the story of color was also the story of commerce, a testament to trade routes that stretched across oceans and deserts, to the skill of dyers who guarded their secrets like treasure. In every bolt of crimson silk or deep indigo wool lay a map of medieval ambition, tracing the roads from dye house to guild hall, from humble workshop to palace chamber. And yet, color was not just for the powerful. In the quiet cottages at the edge of the village, peasants wore the gentle hues of the earth. Browns and soft greens, the colors of soil and leaves. These garments were shaped by the cycles of the seasons and the honest labor of the fields. Though humble, they carried their own kind of dignity, a reflection of a life lived close to the land, of a bond between the people and the soil that fed them. Even the simplest cloak of homespun wool was part of this greater story, a chapter in the medieval tale of how color connected all people to the rhythms of nature and the march of time. The church, too, wove its authority through the rich palette of color. Priests in black robes stood as symbols of solemnity and mourning, while bishops, draped in golden vestments, shone like icons of heavenly glory. In the great cathedrals, stained glass windows blazed with color, filling the dark interiors with a kaleidoscope of sacred light. Blue for the Virgin Mary, red for the blood of Christ, green for the promise of eternal life. Each window a sermon in glass, each hue a prayer that rose with the scent of incense and the murmur of Latin chants. In this world, even the smallest flash of color could carry profound significance. A woman's choice of a green girdle at a midsummer festival was more than an adornment. It was a gesture of hope for fertility and good harvest. A knight's crimson surcoat on the field of battle was not just a uniform, but a banner of courage and loyalty. The way a color draped or gleamed or glowed was a story written on the body, a narrative that blended personal dreams with the weight of tradition. Sumptuary laws, in their anxious precision, tried to control this kaleidoscope of meaning. They spelled out who might wear what color, as though the complexities of ambition and belief could be bound within the pages of a statute book. But the truth of color was wilder than any law. It spilled out in the daring choices of tailors who winked at the rules, in the secret thrill of slipping a forbidden shade into a lining or a hem. The dyer's vats boiled over with more than mere pigment. They seethed with the yearning of a people who refused to let color be tamed. The luxury of certain colors created a shadow world of imitation and ingenuity. In the dye houses, lesser woad was mixed with the rare indigo to create a blue that looked royal but cost far less. In the back rooms of merchant stalls, cheaper madder red was layered to mimic the vibrancy of precious kermes. These were small rebellions, acts of creativity and survival, in a world that demanded both obedience and flair. The sumptuary statutes might punish those who overstepped, but they could not snuff out the human hunger for beauty. And so, in the 1300s, color became a quiet theater of resistance. It was a means of self-expression, a declaration of identity, and a silent act of defiance. A merchant's wife who pinned a small strip of bright cloth to her sleeve was not just following a whim. She was telling the world that she would not be bound by the color of her birth alone. A young craftsman who wore a splash of red at a feast was staking his claim to a future brighter than the dull browns of his trade. In every dyed thread, there was a question. Who gets to decide what beauty looks like, and who gets to wear it? As night falls on our story, let these echoes of color weave themselves into the quiet of your thoughts. In the next part, we will turn to the daily lives of those who wore these colors, how the sumptuary codes shaped their choices, their dreams, and the gentle rebellions that played out in the small moments of medieval life. In the hush of the medieval dawn, as merchants raised their stalls and the first clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoed down narrow lanes, color was already at work. It shaped the lives of every man, woman, and child in ways that were both ordinary and profound. For all the grandeur of kings and bishops, the story of color in the 1300s was also the story of daily life. The quiet, persistent ways in which these hues wove themselves into the fabric of existence. The sumptuary laws were felt most keenly, not in the halls of the highborn, but in the homes and workshops of the common folk. A weaver's wife turning a bolt of wool beneath the light of a small window, might pause to consider whether the deep blue she admired was too fine for her station. The statutes were explicit. Certain colors and materials belonged only to certain ranks. And yet, in the flickering light of her hearth, desire flickered too. Desire for beauty, for status, for a brush of color that could lift her from the everyday. For a farmer's family, color was a kind of silent prayer. Their clothes were often in natural tones, soft browns and greens, the shades of the earth itself. These garments were sturdy and simple, worn for practicality and warmth. But in the homespun threads of their tunics and kirtles, there was still a longing for something more. On feast days, they might wear a scrap of brighter fabric, a small strip of blue ribbon, a carefully dyed hood. These were not grand gestures, but they were enough to hint at a world beyond the fields, a world of pageants and processions, of bright banners and noble courts. For the urban artisans, carpenters, blacksmiths, bakers, color was both a badge of their skill and a sign of their aspirations. In the bustling streets of medieval towns, these craftsmen dressed with a careful balance of modesty and pride. The deep brown of well-tanned leather, the soft gray of good wool. These were the working colors, dignified and practical. But at the edge of every garment might be a hint of something brighter. A touch of red at a collar, a lining of green silk peeking from a sleeve. Such flourishes were small but potent, each a statement of personal ambition, a whisper of hope that the bright colors of the noble courts might one day belong to them too. Merchants, perched on the cusp of prosperity, played a different game altogether. Their lives were shaped by trade, and so too were their wardrobes. They could afford finer cloths and richer hues, blues and reds that glowed with the wealth of distant markets. But they walked a narrow path, too much splendor, and they might be fined or face the jealousy of their peers. Too little, and they risked being overlooked in a world that prized the gleam of gold and the sheen of silk. Their wardrobes became a delicate balancing act, a reflection of both their growing influence and their fear of overstepping the lines drawn by law. Even in the quiet hours of devotion, color had its place. In small chapels and grand cathedrals, candles flickered beneath stained glass that painted the air with sacred light. Blue was for the Virgin's compassion, red for the passion of Christ, green for the hope of resurrection. For the faithful, these colors were not just adornments. They were doorways into the divine, a language of light that turned stone and glass into a living testament of faith. The same people who measured every penny spent on dye and cloth would stand awed before these windows, reminded that in the realm of the sacred, all were lifted beyond the sumptuary bounds. Children, too, learned the weight of color early. A small tunic in a modest hue marked their family's place in the world. A scrap of a brighter shade was a glimpse of a future that might be brighter still. Games played in the dusty streets sometimes echoed this hierarchy. Who got to wear the colorful scraps passed down from older siblings, who were the plainest hand-me-downs. Even in play, color was a lesson, teaching them where they belonged and what might one day be theirs. In these small moments, at the market stall, in the glow of the hearth, in the quiet hush of a church, color was a thread that bound together the medieval world. It was a promise and a constraint, a burden and a hope. Every bolt of cloth, Every patch of dyed wool carried with it not just the labor of hands, but the dreams of those who wore it. In the next part, we will continue this journey through daily life, seeing how color shaped rituals of courtship, of feast and festival, of mourning and of joy. The rhythms of daily life in the 1300s were woven with countless rituals, each one touched by the colors worn and displayed by the people who lived them. From the gentle courtship dances in village squares to the grand feasts held in castle halls, color played a quiet yet vital role, marking stages of life, signaling intentions, and shaping the way individuals saw themselves and others. The sumptuary laws may have drawn lines in fabric and dye, but the hearts of the people found ways to express their own stories within those borders. Courtship and marriage, central to the medieval social fabric, were steeped in color symbolism. A young woman's choice of dress on a festival day was more than a matter of fashion. It was a carefully chosen statement. Wearing green, for example, might speak of fertility and hope, a subtle invitation to suitors. Red, bold and passionate, could mark a declaration of love or a fiery spirit, not easily tamed. The colors worn by brides and grooms on their wedding days carried weighty meanings too. White, rare and precious, symbolized purity and new beginnings, while deeper hues like blue and purple suggested nobility and prosperity. These garments, stitched with care and often passed down through generations, were a tapestry of hopes and promises woven in thread and dye. Feasts and festivals offered another stage where color flourished. The medieval calendar was dotted with holy days and seasonal celebrations, each bringing its own customs and costumes. In the warmth of summer fairs, bright fabrics fluttered in the breeze as minstrels played and dancers spun. The streets filled with a riot of color, scarlets, golds, blues, that lifted spirits and marked moments of joy. Even the poorest villagers might don their best. A patch of vivid cloth here, a newly dyed kerchief there, transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary. Sumptuary laws tried to govern these displays, but festivals were a time when rules were loosened and the colors of the crowd blurred together in a joyous celebration of life's richness. Mourning, too, was a chapter of color in medieval life. Black, the color of loss and solemnity, was carefully prescribed by law and custom. To wear black was to mark the weight of grief, to show respect for the departed and signal a period of reflection. But even in mourning, color held nuances. Shades of gray and dark blue might soften the starkness of pure black, allowing a quiet expression of hope amidst sorrow. The garments of mourning became a language of memory, a way to carry those lost with dignity and love. And in some cases, the laws surrounding mourning attire were as strict as those governing royal robes, a reminder that even in sorrow, social order was preserved through color. The church remained central to this interplay of color and daily life. The clergy's vestments shifted with the liturgical calendar. Purple for penitence, white for celebration, red for the martyrs, green for ordinary time. These colors were more than visual markers. They shaped the rhythm of belief, guiding the faithful through the cycles of sin, redemption, and hope. Lay people, too, marked religious festivals with their clothing, donning colors that reflected their faith and aspirations. In this way, color became a bridge between the earthly and the divine, a tangible link between the mundane and the sacred. Even the marketplaces, bustling and noisy, were arenas where color told stories. Traders displayed bolts of cloth in every shade imaginable, tempting customers with the promise of transformation. For the buyer, selecting a piece of fabric was an act of imagination, dreaming of who they could be or who they might become. A merchant's vibrant scarf could signal his success. A housewife's apron, dyed in cheerful red or blue, might brighten the humblest kitchen. The marketplace was a stage where color bridged the gap between status and aspiration, between the fixed laws of society and the fluid desires of the human heart. Children, growing up in this vivid world, absorbed the lessons of color early. Their games mimicked the grown-ups' rituals, their clothes reflecting their family's place and dreams. A child wearing a bright ribbon might be seen as hopeful, one in plain tones, grounded in tradition. These early encounters with color taught them the language of their world, preparing them to navigate the intricate dance of social order and personal expression that would define their lives. In every corner of medieval life, from dawn till dusk, color was a silent partner, a thread weaving through the fabric of existence, binding people to their communities and to their dreams. The sumptuary laws tried to regulate these threads, to map out a world where every shade was accounted for and every hue confined. But human nature, rich with desire and creativity, found ways to slip color through the cracks, turning garments into declarations, accessories into statements, and everyday moments into living tapestries of meaning. As your thoughts settle deeper into the quiet of the night, let the colors of medieval life linger like the faint glow of dawn on a stained glass window. In the next part, we will journey into the lives of the tailors, dyers, and merchants, the artisans and traders whose hands brought these colors to life and whose stories illuminate the hidden side of sumptuary law. Behind every vibrant robe, every shimmering cloak, and every richly dyed garment of the 1300s, there was a skilled artisan, dyers, weavers, tailors, whose expertise transformed simple threads into objects of beauty and meaning. These craftsmen were the quiet architects of color, working with secret knowledge and delicate hands to create the hues that shaped medieval society. While the sumptuary laws dictated who could wear certain colors, it was these artisans who controlled the very essence of color itself, holding the keys to a world of prestige and power woven in fabric. Dyers, in particular, were central figures in this colorful tapestry. Their craft was part science, part magic, conducted in the dark, steamy confines of dye houses where vats bubbled with mysterious liquids. The process was long, complicated, and required exact timing and temperature to coax the right shade from raw materials. The purple dyes, especially, were prized above all else. Derived from the tiny sea snails found in the Mediterranean, the preparation of Tyrian purple was a guarded secret, and the color was as difficult to produce as it was expensive. Only the most skilled dyers could manage to extract its rich, royal hues without wasting the precious resource. These artisans were often members of guilds, organizations that regulated trade secrets and ensured quality control. Guild membership gave dyers and weavers a certain prestige, but also bound them to strict rules. Rules designed to maintain the reputation of their craft and protect their economic interests. The guilds also enforced sumptuary laws indirectly, as they controlled the supply of certain colors and fabrics. A dyer who supplied forbidden purple to a commoner could face harsh penalties, not just from civic authorities, but from his own guild brothers. Thus, these craftsmen were both enforcers and rebels, balancing loyalty to their trade with the temptation to satisfy the growing demand for luxury. The materials these artisans worked with were sourced from near and far, telling their own story of medieval commerce and connection. Indigo, for example, came from India and Southeast Asia, traveling long routes through caravan cities and port towns before reaching the dyer's vat. Kermes red, harvested from tiny insects found in the Mediterranean region, required careful collection and processing. Even the humble woad, a native plant used for blue dye in Europe, demanded skill to turn its leaves into a lasting color. Each ingredient carried its own cost and prestige, shaping the choices available to the artisans and their customers. Tailors, too, played a vital role in this colorful world. They took the dyed cloth and shaped it into garments that fit the body and the social order. The cut of a sleeve, the length of a hem, the placement of buttons or clasps, all of these details were scrutinized by sumptuary laws and by society itself. A tailor had to know not only how to make a garment, but how to make it correct for the wearer's rank and station. This required knowledge of the legal codes as well as the fashions of court and town. Tailors often worked closely with their clients, advising them on color choices and styles that would honor the law while expressing personal taste. Merchants who traded in cloth and dyes were the vital link between artisans and consumers. These traders were worldly men and women who knew the value of color in every market from Venice to London to Bruges. They negotiated prices, assessed quality, and sometimes took risks smuggling forbidden colors or luxurious fabrics past customs and watchful eyes. The merchant's ability to bring rare and beautiful cloth to a customer could make or break fortunes, and their knowledge of sumptuary laws helped them navigate a complex web of restrictions and opportunities. For all their skill and craft, these artisans and merchants were often caught in the tensions between regulation and desire. The laws that sought to restrict who could wear purple or fine silks were as much about preserving social order as they were about protecting economic interests. But demand for luxury goods grew steadily throughout the 1300s, fueled by the rising merchant class and the ambitions of lesser nobles. This hunger for color and finery pushed artisans to innovate, to find new dyes, new techniques, and new ways to satisfy their customers without falling foul of the law. The craft of color was not just a trade, it was a dialogue between society's strict hierarchies and the human impulse for beauty and distinction. In dye houses and workshops, in merchant stalls and tailors' shops, the story of medieval color unfolded in all its complexity, marked by tradition and rebellion, by skill and aspiration. These artisans shaped the very texture of medieval life, their hands weaving the vibrant threads of history into the cloth of everyday existence. In the next part, we will delve deeper into the lives of these artisans, uncovering the secrets of their trade, the challenges they faced, and the creative solutions they developed to keep the colors flowing through medieval society. The life of a medieval dyer was a complex balance of skill, secrecy, and survival. Their craft demanded an intimate knowledge of natural materials, plants, minerals, and insects, each requiring careful handling to produce the brilliant hues desired by the market. Tyrian purple, the most coveted of all, was painstakingly extracted from the mucus glands of the murex sea snail, a process that took thousands of snails for just a small amount of dye. Because of its rarity and cost, this dye was often reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. To wear it without permission was to risk severe penalties, making dyers custodians of a secret that was as much about power as it was about color. The process of dyeing itself was fraught with challenges. Timing was critical. Leaving cloth in the dye bath too long could ruin the fabric, while too short a soak would result in a faded or uneven color. Temperature control was essential, often reliant on intuition and experience rather than precise instruments. The use of mordants, substances like alum or iron, to fix the dye to the cloth required further expertise. Each color demanded its own method and mix, making the dyer's art a delicate science passed down through apprenticeships and guild traditions. Guilds served as both protectors and regulators of this knowledge. The dyers' guilds controlled who could practice the craft, monitored the quality of work, and enforced sumptuary laws by restricting the sale of certain colors and fabrics. Membership in a guild brought prestige and protection, but also strict rules and oversight. Guild members were expected to adhere to codes that forbade selling forbidden colors to those who were not entitled to wear them, a role that placed dyers at the intersection of commerce, law, and social order. Tailors, working closely with dyers, translated these colors into garments that followed the strict guidelines of sumptuary law. They crafted clothing that not only fit the body, but also conformed to legal and social expectations. Tailors had to be well versed in the current laws, which dictated who could wear what fabric and color, as well as in fashion trends influenced by the courts and nobility. Their skill lay not just in cutting and sewing, but in advising clients on how to navigate the delicate line between legality and style. Merchants were the essential links who connected these artisans to a broader world. They imported rare dyes like indigo from India or kermes from the Mediterranean, dealing with long and often perilous trade routes. Merchants understood the value of color as a symbol of status and wealth, and were adept at negotiating with dyers and tailors to meet their clients' demands. Some merchants also skirted the edges of legality, smuggling forbidden fabrics or dyes to satisfy the appetite of ambitious buyers eager to flaunt their status. Innovation was a hallmark of this artisan network. Faced with restrictions and the high cost of certain dyes, craftsmen experimented with blending cheaper materials to imitate forbidden colors. For example, woad was often mixed with small amounts of indigo to create a blue that approached the richness of imported dyes, but at a lower cost. These creative solutions allowed wider access to colors that were otherwise restricted, subtly undermining the strict lines drawn by sumptuary laws. Yet, this world was not without its tensions. The tension between regulation and desire created a marketplace of both conformity and rebellion. Dyers, tailors, and merchants navigated these tensions daily, sometimes enforcing the rules, sometimes finding loopholes or bending them. Their work was an ongoing negotiation between the needs of society to maintain order and the human desire for expression and beauty. In the end, the artisans of color were more than craftsmen. They were keepers of a secret language, translators of social hierarchy into the visual world of fabric and hue. Their hands shaped not just cloth, but the very identity of medieval society, weaving together threads of law, culture, and aspiration. The colors they produced were badges of status, markers of identity, and sometimes quiet acts of defiance. As the night deepens, let the story of these artisans remind you of the hidden complexities behind every shade you see. In the next part, we will explore the fascinating intersections of sumptuary laws with politics and power, the ways in which color and clothing became tools of control and rebellion in the medieval world. In the 1300s, color was not merely a matter of personal taste or fashion. It was a powerful language of politics and social control. Sumptuary laws, which dictated who could wear what colors and fabrics, were as much about maintaining political order as they were about preserving social hierarchy. The ruling classes understood that controlling color meant controlling perception, who appeared powerful, who appeared noble, and who appeared subordinate. Purple, in particular, symbolized royal authority and divine right, making it a potent political tool and a visible marker of power. The association of purple with royalty stretched back to antiquity. The ancient Romans and Byzantines prized Tyrian purple, a dye so rare and expensive that it was reserved for emperors and senators. This tradition carried into medieval Europe, where kings and high-ranking nobles donned purple to signify their elevated status. By restricting purple's use to the elite, sumptuary laws ensured that the color remained a symbol of legitimate authority and privilege, not open to imitation by the lower classes. Wearing purple without permission was seen as a direct challenge to the social order, a visual rebellion that threatened to blur the lines of rank and power. But the laws around color went beyond just purple. They covered a broad spectrum of hues and fabrics, each linked to specific ranks and offices. For example, gold and silver embroidery were reserved for the highest nobility. Silks and velvets were restricted to the wealthy. Certain reds and blues could only be worn by those of a particular social standing. These restrictions created a coded system where the colors and textures of one's clothing broadcasted their place in the political hierarchy. To look at a crowd was to read a map of power, a tapestry of rank woven in thread and dye. Monarchs used these laws strategically to assert control and reinforce their rule. By legislating who could wear what, kings and queens sent clear messages about who belonged where in the social order. The enforcement of sumptuary laws was often harsh, with fines, confiscations, or even imprisonment for those who disobeyed. This served to remind everyone that the social hierarchy was not a vague idea, but a strictly maintained reality, with color as one of its most visible signs. However, this system was not without its challenges. As commerce and trade flourished, new wealth emerged in the hands of merchants and lesser nobles, who sought to assert their status through clothing and color. The rising middle class's desire for luxury and recognition put pressure on the traditional order. Sumptuary laws were a way to push back against this social mobility, to keep the markers of privilege tightly controlled. Yet, as we have seen, artisans and merchants found ways to work around these laws, creating new hues and fashions that blurred the lines and challenged the rigid social codes. At times, color also became a tool of rebellion and protest. Wearing forbidden colors could be an act of defiance, a way for the emerging classes or political factions to signal dissent or ambition. In some regions, groups who felt marginalized or oppressed used color to assert identity and resist control. The laws themselves sometimes sparked controversy and conflict, as individuals and communities pushed back against restrictions that seemed unfair or oppressive. Political power was also exercised through ceremonial dress. royal courts staged elaborate displays where color played a central role in rituals of power and legitimacy. Crowns were set against velvet robes dyed in royal purples and rich reds. Courtiers wore costumes that signified their closeness to the monarch. These public spectacles reinforced the social order and reminded subjects of the divine right and earthly power of their rulers. The interplay of light on embroidered fabrics and the glow of precious dyes turned court gatherings into theatrical affirmations of hierarchy. Beyond the courts, color influenced alliances and enmities. Nobles might adopt family colors or livery that identified their faction in times of war or political rivalry. These visual markers became crucial on the battlefield and in the halls of power, signaling loyalty and shaping perceptions. The use of color in heraldry, on shields, banners, and tabards, was an extension of these sumptuary principles, where every shade carried meaning and every combination told a story of lineage and allegiance. This intricate relationship between color, politics, and power reveals how sumptuary laws were far more than simple dress codes. They were mechanisms of governance, symbols of control, and instruments of social engineering. To wear a certain color was to claim a place in the political order, or, conversely, to challenge it. In the next section, we will explore how these political dynamics played out in specific historical events and the ways in which sumptuary laws were both enforced and contested in the streets and courts of medieval Europe. The enforcement and contestation of sumptuary laws in medieval Europe reveal the complexities of power, identity, and resistance during the 1300s. These laws were not static edicts handed down and blindly obeyed. They were living instruments, shaped by the political currents of the time and the ambitions of individuals and groups seeking to assert or challenge authority. The interplay between rulers, nobility, merchants, and commoners played out vividly through the politics of color. One striking example occurred in England under the reign of Edward III, who issued several sumptuary laws in the mid-14th century aimed at reinforcing social distinctions. These laws regulated who could wear silk, velvet, fur, and certain colors, including purple and gold. The motivations behind these decrees were not only about aesthetics, but also about consolidating royal authority and limiting the ostentatious displays of wealth among the rising merchant class. The king and his council understood that allowing commoners to dress like nobility threatened the perceived natural order and their own political power. However, the implementation of these laws proved difficult. Merchants and prosperous townspeople often flaunted the rules, investing in fine fabrics and forbidden colors to signal their success and elevate their social standing. Some challenged the laws openly, while others found creative ways to circumvent restrictions, such as wearing permitted colors but in richer fabrics or combining different textiles to create an illusion of luxury. Enforcement varied from place to place and depended heavily on local officials who were sometimes reluctant or unable to impose penalties consistently. In cities like Florence and Venice, where trade wealth fueled a burgeoning middle class, sumptuary laws became battlegrounds of social negotiation. The laws were frequently revised and reissued to curb excesses, reflecting the ongoing tensions between traditional aristocracy and new moneyed elites. Despite the efforts of authorities, the desire to display wealth and status through clothing and color persisted, driving a cycle of regulation and resistance. Color also played a significant role during political conflicts and revolts. During the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses, for instance, the use of color to identify factions was critical. Nobles and their retainers wore livery in specific colors to signal allegiance and rally support. These colors became charged symbols, transforming from mere decoration into emblems of loyalty or defiance. The control over such visual symbols was a crucial element in the struggle for power, as the ability to command loyalty through recognizable colors could tip the balance in battles and negotiations. In some cases, sumptuary laws intersected with religious and cultural tensions. Certain colors or styles could be associated with particular ethnic or religious groups, adding layers of meaning to the politics of dress. This dynamic sometimes led to discriminatory practices, where laws about clothing became tools of exclusion or persecution. The enforcement of sumptuary laws thus had consequences beyond social hierarchy, influencing community relations and identity. Despite the rigid framework imposed by the laws, fashion and color remained fluid and contested spaces. The rise of the merchant class, the spread of new dyeing techniques, and the cross-cultural exchanges through trade all contributed to a vibrant and evolving visual culture. People continuously negotiated their identities through what they wore, challenging the boundaries set by law while also recognizing the power those boundaries held. By the end of the 1300s, the sumptuary laws had become deeply embedded in the social and political fabric of medieval Europe. They were symbols of a society striving to maintain order in a time of change, attempting to use color and clothing as tools of governance, status, and power. Yet, these efforts also revealed the limitations of control and the enduring human desire to express individuality and aspiration, even within strict confines. As your thoughts rest in the quiet shadow of this intricate world, consider how the colors of power once shaped not just garments, but the very structure of medieval society. In the final part, we will gently conclude our journey through sumptuary laws by reflecting on their legacy and the echoes they leave in the modern world. The echoes of the sumptuary laws of the 1300s stretch far beyond their medieval origins, rippling through centuries of fashion, social order, and cultural expression. While the strict enforcement of who could wear purple or velvet may seem like a relic of a distant past, the underlying ideas behind these laws continue to influence how societies think about clothing, status, and identity, even today. The legacy of these laws reveals the persistent human desire to control and express social distinctions through appearance. At their core, sumptuary laws were about defining boundaries between classes, genders, professions, and even ethnic groups. They sought to make visible the social order by regulating what people could wear, turning fabric and color into symbols of identity and power. This impulse to codify clothing as a marker of social difference is something that resonates throughout history, seen in later dress codes, uniforms, and even modern fashion trends. In many ways, modern dress codes and social expectations around clothing can trace a lineage back to these medieval laws. Though contemporary societies generally lack the legal strictness of sumptuary edicts, unwritten rules about what is appropriate for certain occasions or roles persist. For instance, professional attire, whether a business suit, a uniform, or ceremonial dress, function similarly by signaling status, role, and belonging. The idea that what you wear communicates your social position or identity remains deeply ingrained. Fashion itself can be seen as an ongoing dialogue between conformity and individuality, much like the medieval tension between sumptuary laws and personal expression. Just as merchants in the 1300s found ways to bend the rules to display their rising status, people today use clothing to challenge norms, assert identity, or signal belonging to various groups. The push and pull between social expectations and personal style continues to shape the cultural landscape. The color purple still holds a special place in cultural symbolism, often associated with royalty, luxury, and spirituality. This association, rooted in the historical rarity and expense of purple dye, is a direct legacy of the sumptuary laws that guarded the color so jealously. Purple's modern symbolic weight, seen in everything from ceremonial robes to branding, reminds us of the deep connections between color, power, and prestige. Beyond color, the legacy of sumptuary laws also invites reflection on how societies regulate difference more broadly. The medieval laws were one form of social control, but they represent a wider human tendency to categorize and rank people, often through visible markers like clothing, language, or behavior. Understanding this history encourages us to think critically about how such markers continue to shape inclusion and exclusion in our own time. The study of these laws also opens a window into medieval life, revealing not just the rigidity of social order, but the creativity and resilience of those who lived within it. Artisans who crafted the fabrics, merchants who traded them, and wearers who navigated the rules all contributed to a dynamic culture of color and clothing. Their stories remind us that behind every law and regulation, there are individuals finding ways to express identity and humanity. In exploring the legacy of sumptuary laws, we also glimpse the broader history of fashion as a social force, a language that speaks of power, aspiration, resistance, and change. The medieval efforts to control appearance are an early chapter in this ongoing story, illustrating how deeply intertwined clothing and society truly are. As we begin to close this gentle journey through time, let the memory of these laws and their colorful world linger softly, a reminder of the past's complex layers that still color our present. The sumptuary laws of the 1300s, though centuries old, continue to echo in unexpected ways throughout modern society. While no longer enforced by kings or councils, their spirit lives on in the subtle social codes that dictate how we present ourselves, who gets to wear what, and how fashion becomes a tool for both inclusion and exclusion. These medieval laws, in their attempt to freeze social order through clothing, actually highlight a timeless truth. People always find ways to express identity beyond imposed boundaries. Today, we see this legacy in the uniforms worn by professionals, doctors, police officers, judges, each using specific attire to communicate authority, expertise, or trust. These uniforms echo medieval restrictions, marking clear lines of role and respect. Likewise, dress codes in schools, workplaces, and religious institutions serve as modern versions of sumptuary laws, guiding behavior and signaling belonging or difference. Even in casual fashion, unwritten rules about appropriateness reflect the ongoing negotiation between individual expression and social expectation. Fashion designers and brands play a unique role in this story. Where medieval artisans and guilds controlled access to certain colors and fabrics, today's fashion houses create trends that define who's in or out, often drawing on history and symbolism to craft their messages. Purple, once a royal monopoly, now appears freely on runways and streets, but it still carries echoes of its luxurious past. The democratization of color and style contrasts with its historical exclusivity, illustrating how social meanings evolve but never fully disappear. The persistence of color symbolism also reminds us of the ways culture shapes meaning. Purple remains linked to royalty, spirituality, and luxury, while other colors like black, white, red, and blue carry their own layered histories and associations. These meanings shift across time and place, yet they all trace roots back to early systems like sumptuary laws that assigned status through appearance. Understanding this helps us appreciate how much of our daily visual language is inherited from long ago. Beyond fashion, the concept of regulating appearance speaks to broader questions of power and control. Sumptuary laws reveal how societies seek to maintain order by making social hierarchies visible and enforceable. They also show the limits of such control as people continuously adapt, resist, and reimagine identity. This dynamic remains relevant today as debates about dress codes, cultural appropriation, and personal freedom continue to unfold. Reflecting on these laws encourages us to look deeper into the clothes we wear and the colors we choose. Each piece of clothing carries stories of history, culture, aspiration, and sometimes defiance. What may seem like simple choices are often woven with complex social threads that link us to past and present. The legacy of sumptuary laws invites us to see clothing not just as fabric, but as language, a language that speaks of who we are, where we come from, and who we want to be. As your mind drifts toward rest, consider this: the vibrant hues and carefully crafted garments of medieval Europe were much more than decoration. They were symbols of power, identity, and the human need to belong. Even now, in the quiet moments of the night, the colors we surround ourselves with tell stories that stretch back across centuries. Thank you for joining this slow and gentle journey through the world of sumptuary laws, royal purples, and the fascinating interplay of color, culture, and control. May these reflections bring a peaceful close to your day, wrapping you softly in the rich tapestry of history.